rope and making soothing noises. By the twitching of her legs and her pained braying, it wasn't working. A white bag hung from her back end and dripped with fluid, and above it 2 small hooves crossed at the ankles. "John," I said, "I'm no good with." John tied a rope around each hoof and passed one to me so that both ropes crossed over each other. He handed me the end of it and placed the 2 of us diagonally across it from each other, about 4 feet away from the back end of the cow. Then he looked across at me and he said, "Now, Ellie, pull like hell." As John started a tug, I stood holding the rope in horror until he shouted, "Pull, Ellie, pull." So I pulled. My shoes struggled to get a grip on the wet ground, and I pulled and pulled, but the calf wasn't moving. The cow was getting more and more distressed, and Paud was struggling to hold her steady. John was sweating now. "She's not coming," John said. I heard panic in his voice. "Stretch her," Paud said. "She won't like it, but it might help." "Here," John said, handing me his side of the rope. "Let's give it a try." He stood to the side of the animal and, pulling his hands inside her, pulled back the tight, steaming flesh that flanked the calf's tiny feet. "Pull," he said, barely able to get the words out with his physical exertion. "Come in closer, Ellie. Hold the weight even on either side and pull." I could barely believe what he was expecting me to do, but at the same time I could see we had no choice. I wrapped the rope around my forearms and wrists and leaned back with my full weight against the calf's hooves. Almost immediately, I felt some loosening on the rope, but before I knew it, the back end of the animal had showered me with the contents of its bowels, covering me from head to toe in fetid brown muck. I screamed so loudly that some of it went into my mouth, and I screamed again. The men could barely hide their amusement, and when John said, "I think we're getting somewhere, Ellie," his voice was high-pitched, as if he might laugh at any minute, and that made me so mad that I pulled even harder than before. I pulled on the contents of that wretched cow's womb until she hollered and struggled against Paud. I pulled until my shoulders felt they were going to tear apart from each other, until my shoes were so full of muck that my toes were scrabbling around inside them. "Here she comes," John said. As he did, the calf suddenly slithered out onto the wet floor easily, as if it had just been waiting for its time. It fell at my feet, a slime-covered oblong of flesh, then immediately started to unfurl itself into a calf. As I watched the infant animal flick out its limbs and engage in its feeble struggle to become what it was, something stirred inside me. I squatted down next to it and looked into the confused slits of its eyes and smelt the sweet, warm fog of its first breath. John came over and handed me some straw. "Clean her off and rub some warmth into her there, Ellie. She'll be in shock. I'll go and get cleaned up." I sat with the struggling calf in my lap and cleaned her, rubbing her silky black and white coat into rough peaks, until Paud came and took her away from me, leading her up to her mother's teat. When I got outside, it was raining hard, but instead of rushing back into the house, I turned my face upward and let the shower rinse me down. I felt the cool water trickle down my scalp and the back of my dress, dripping from the tip of my eyelashes down onto my cheeks, drumming down the front of my clothes until they were stuck to me. With my eyes closed, I could hear the thrash of the raindrops on the trees and the continuous splat of water hitting the muddy ground. I opened my eyes and turned my face towards the house. 2 small birds were feeding from crumbs I'd left on the windowsill, and John was standing in the doorway, barefoot, stripped to the waist and holding a towel. "Come in before you get your death of cold," he said, smiling. I remembered that I loved him. And in that moment, the part of me that I had left in Ireland with John when I went to America came back and greeted me. As much as I yearned for the sophistication of New York, for all the muck and the rain, in the wake of the savagery and miracle of the animal's birth, I felt I was at home again. I've taken up enough of your time. If any of you have got any questions, I could stand here all night and tell you my entire family history. If anyone,
what did it feel like to hear that your grandmother's voice when you first heard it? Can you remember?
Oh, it was amazing because Cullen had done these tapes, and of course we had no interest in being like, yeah, whatever. We know all the stories about the barefoot to mass and the poverty and all of this, that, and the other. And I think when we had the tapes after she died, we were grief-stricken because she lived with us and she was a really strong member of our family. And so it was probably about 10 years after she died that we listened to the tapes again. And it was extraordinary. They were very revealing, not just in the historical details, but in the personal details. Because I think some ways when you're a child, you don't really look at your grandparents as people. You just kind of look at them as grandparents. They're just kind of these relics in the corner. And hearing her talk about her life was, it was extraordinary. The things that, like, she was obsessed with the summer of 1934, which was a summer when her sister Mary had come home on holiday from America. And she goes on and on and on about it in the tapes, saying that this was the best, most wonderful summer of her life, and that everything else after that was just rubbish, really, including the birth of her 4 children, and her career, and her wonderful marriage. It just meant nothing. That 1934 was the zenith of her life. So it was revealing of her character. Yeah, it was kind of emotional hearing her voice again after all that time. It really does bring them alive. I'm recording now my mother for Prosperity, and it's such an easy thing to do now. When I go into schools in Ireland, I try to encourage the kids to record as much as they can now of their parents and their grandparents talking about their lives, because of course it's completely different now to how it was. We have, wonderful kind of little gizmos and cameras and the internet and everything. So, yeah. Oh, gentlemen.
Great book, by the way.
Thank you very much.
I understand you left England in 1990.
Yes, yeah.
What were the circumstances that you left England?
Well, I left to go and live in Ireland really out of pure passion for a man and also for Ireland. I had a very successful career in London as a young women's magazine editor, but I had a graw to write and I had a graw for Ireland, and a job came up in Ireland. And the thing about, even now, jobs in the media in Ireland are very hard to come by, and that was the field that I was working in. And I became aware that basically what happens in Ireland in the media is people get a job and then they stay there until they're dead, and then then a relation of theirs inherits the job. So this job came up, and I really felt better go to Ireland now and do it. So it was in 1990, and it was a very different place to the place that it became. But it's going back to that now. We have no money again now. And I'd acquired an Irish boyfriend, which was bizarre. But I think that, bizarre because he I was like this young, kind of groovy, it's hard to believe it now, but I was this kind of young, kind of trendy fashion magazine editor. And he was just was into hunting and fishing, and like he'd do things like I'd go over for the weekend and he'd give me 2 ducks in a bag, and I'd have to bring them home, on the plane, on the tube, and everything. And I wanted to be with him, so yeah, I came over for him. I didn't marry him; I got rid of him.
What year was your grandmother born? How old was she when she died?
Oh. Do you know what? It's written on that sheet of paper. I can't actually remember. She was born in 1907 and 1990. She died in 1990. And it was really her death, I think. After she died, I was working in London. I had a really great job, and I was young, and everything was great. And I came over her funeral, and I spent 2 weeks in her house with my Uncle Cullen, the guy who did these tapes. And while I was over for those 2 weeks, I just was walking around, the beaches and being in her house, and I just thought, this is where I really want to be here. I know it's weird, and I'm young, and I'm having a great time in London, but I just want to be here, And I just had a graw for it and a feel for it, so I went there then. But she was